Hello and welcome. Research for Real by Dr. Mohsin Malik, my YouTube channel. I am Mohsin Malik. I've been asked by someone who wanted to do a survey research study to share my non-response bias test approach. And here am I. Quickly speaking, the sources for my approach are the three that you see on the screen. First, I'll give a bit of conceptual background. Why do we need a non-response bias? Why it is important? See, whenever we approach population of interest for our survey study, what we do is that we only get a sample. Now, there's a valid question: is that the responses that we get from our sample, would those who did not participate in the study, would they have responded in a different way? Our findings would be different if those non-respondents somehow contribute to this study. So that's a very valid question. In order to answer this very valid question, we need to first identify what we wanted to do from our study, what are our objectives. There are two broad objectives that I can think of at this stage: is whether we want to infer the findings from our sample into a larger population of interest. For example, there's a demographic group that we wanted to investigate, how they behave, how they act. We gather information from a subgroup of that demographic in a typical city or in a particular city. Now, once we finish that study or the analysis, we want to extend the statistical findings from that subgroup, that sample within a city to the country. For that, it is very important that we provide as much detail about our sampling, how representative our sample is, how we are inferring those to the population in this context sample. Non-response bias is very, very important, and for that I refer to you the Holland 2018 paper, so you can go and have a look on what are the contemporary best practices in that. Then there's another set of studies, mainly in the business school, management scholars, organizational scholars. What they do is they test theory. They theorize relationship that given this theory, X would contribute to Y through this pathway. And for that, to test the theory, those theorized relationships, they need to go to the people who have expertise in those theoretical concepts. Still, there is a population of respondents with requisite subject matter expertise, but the objective is not to infer that to the findings to a larger population. That is not the major priority. However, we still need to account for the possibility that non-respondents to our study could have responded differently, could have identified the statistical relationships in a different way. So that's the second approach. And what I'm going to do, being a management scholar, what I do is I follow survey non-response bias, which is somewhat sufficient in terms of establishing the rigor of your study. There are some limitations that we'll talk later. So effectively, we did our study, we identified relationships, went to a target response, and then we collected data. Now, how do we approach those who did not respond? We don't know anything about them, right? We try to approach them, they are not approachable. So it's quite impractical of collecting responses to check that, how they would have responded. For that, back in 1977, Armstrong and Overton came up with an assumption for male surveys is that those who were late respondents, they may be assumed similar to non-respondents. And if that assumption is followed, then we can very quickly establish survey non-response bias for our study. What we do is we perform a Nonparametric test, Mann-Whitney U Test, to compare the statistically valid differences between the two assumed independent samples. Now, how do we do the independent samples? Whatever respondents we've got, we divide them into two halves, or first 25 or the last 25, or first half or the last half. So first one are the early respondents. The second subsample within our respondent become the late respondents, which we are assuming would have behaved in a way similar to non-respondent. If that is the case, then we can do a hypothesis testing with the two hypotheses being null, being that they are the same, the two subsamples are the same, and alternate they're not the same, and get the p-value and make a decision whether there is a possibility that the relationships that are identified would have been identified differently by the non-respondents. So that's the conceptual background. Now, next step is that we'll contextualize this to a study, a published study that you can access and can follow your steps, your own steps to conduct your own research. So in this particular case, what you see is my study from 2024. We've identified relationships between few theoretical constructs, and it's based on socio-cognitive theory. And so, yeah, it's a theory testing. We need to go to people who would have experienced these theoretical phenomena in practice, and we'll collect data from them and see how they see if they support these theoretical relationships that we identified based on socio-cognitive theory. So in this particular case, what we did was we had a sample of, I think, 184 respondents, and we divide them into two halves. We could have done 25, last 25. In this particular case, we did N1 as the first half, N2 as the second half, as the late respondents. The late respondents are assumed to be similar to non-respondents. Perform a Mann-Whitney U Test, which we'll just do, and then interpret the results. For that, what I need to do now is I need to go to my SPSS for theoretical constructs that you saw in the slides, the response here. So what I have done is, as I mentioned to you, 184 respondents, I have divided the first 92, what you can see here, 92 as 1, and the remaining 92 as 2. And what I can also go is respondent. So I've already done the coding, but now I tell the SPSS that you assume 1 as early respondent, 2 as late respondent. And with that, now what I need to do is quickly go to analyze. I go to my data view, I go to analyze, and then I go to non-parametric test. I go to legacy dialogues. I go to two independent samples. What we are assuming is that these four theoretical constructs, we're comparing the response across these four theoretical constructs, their responses. We take the grouping variable. We've already identified that first 50% are 1, and the second 50%, second half is 2. I just tell now SPSS that you assume that as N1 and N2, and perform hypothesis testing here through the Mann-Whitney U Test, which is selected here. Let's go. Okay, so you get two of these dialog boxes. I'll explain these two dialog boxes going back to my slides, which is here. I go to the next slide where I did the software implementation SPSS, now making sense of data. Now, this is the descriptive and rankings, which we can skip at the moment. Key thing is the p-value to check if the hypothesis, null hypothesis, needs to be retained or rejected. So we could see that all four p-values for all theoretical constructs, comparing N1 and N2 for all these theoretical constructs, there's significantly more than 0.05. That means that based on this, we do not reject null hypothesis. We keep the null hypothesis. That means that the early respondents are the same as the late respondent. Their responses are the same. And if we follow the Armstrong and Earton assumption that late respondents are more similar to non-respondents, by the way, this assumption has been followed by almost everybody in this type of research, where you test theoretical relationships, because of the practicality of determining the doing this test. Based on this, we conclude that non-response bias is not a concern in this context. So as easy as it can get, very simple test, giving you all the details, some limitations. Basically, the limitations is to deal with the assumption, and you can go back to Holland and they talk about this one. But this type of research, it's pretty decent to very widely followed, and you can do this test to show the rigor of your study. Thank you very much.